Hi everyone, this is the first in a series of 3 short lectures about using CSS to animate your web pages. And we'll be talking about this as our last sort of foray into techniques related to CSS specifically, and then we'll move on to some other design-oriented stuff for the rest of the class. This lecture is going to focus primarily on transitions, which let you change um, different CSS properties to alter the way that an element looks on screen over some duration of time. These can be combined with transforms, which let us move or shift things around visually in either 2 or 3 dimensions, a virtual 3-dimensional space anyway. And we'll be talking about that in the next lecture in this little series. And then finally, we'll bring it all together with using animation as kind of part of the set of techniques that we're building through here. But for today, we're just talking about transitions. So here is a simple transition demo. And we have what you can see here looks like a navigation menu. And I'm going to have us look over here a bit. So if we look in the HTML, we've got pretty standard stuff. We've got an unordered list. We have list elements, or list items rather, that match what's on screen over here. And then as we look at the CSS, we can see that there are some things about it that might look a little different to what we would normally have. So we can see under the A for links, the A element, there's a transition that governs like all of the changes that happen to those elements in the list that makes up our nav menu. And down here, we can see these pseudo classes, which you should already be aware of. And what they're going to do is change the list items properties based on what's in these two blocks. So in this first one, the background color we can expect to become purple. So right now it's either there's no background or it's white. And then in the second one, the A element is actually going to change text color. So we can see now when we mouse over these that that's exactly what happens. The thing that's making the element transition smoothly is this line, this transition all 600 milliseconds. So the transition happens over the course of 600 milliseconds. And you can see what effect that produces. So how do we do this? How do we get there? This is a breakdown of the parts of a transition. So inside that transition block or property, there are 2 required values, and then there are 2 that are optional, and we'll discuss why they're optional and what you might use them for. But basically, all you have to do is set a property that you want to change. So let me move back to our last slide. In the last slide, you can see that all of the properties, so like everything inside of these 3 blocks, that means that everything is going to change along with this. So that's our transition property. So we can specify all of them. You can specify them one at a time. You can specify them to transition differently. The duration, of course, is how long it will take. And there's a lot of different ways that you can decide on this, but typically people use 250 to 300 milliseconds as like the optimal transition time. So that one in the last slide was a little slow. You can use seconds or milliseconds. So if you want them to be longer, you don't have to use milliseconds. You can just use seconds. And this will let you control pretty finely how the change appears on screen over what period of time. The timing function is an optional value that you can manipulate, and this lets you set how the timing will move. So does it happen all at once, or does it happen slowly but at the same rate across the transition, or does it move real fast in the beginning and then slow at the end? We'll look at different ways to make those things change to our liking. And then the delay, if you want to use that, is, which is also optional, is just specifies how long you wait on mouse over, in this case, to make the transition. So here's another hover transition. And so we're using the same basic logic here. We've got our div is set up, so we have everything like normal. The background color is dark slate gray. Let's see, what else do we have in here that's going to change? The font size is that's 150% of whatever is set for the whole page. And then our transition is going to change these two properties about the div element. So it's going to change the font size over 300 milliseconds, and it's going to change the background over 1 second. The changes that we're doing, right? So the pseudo class hover is going to make us see a pointer that shows up instead of the little like normal pointer. The font size is going to go up, and the background is going to change to purple. Okay, so let's see this in action. Let's watch our hover happen. All right, so see how this worked? We start off slate gray, we move over it, and it turns purple, and then the text gets bigger, and that's all specified in that pseudo class. This is just a brief overview of the syntax, so with actual examples in it. So you can see, like in the case of the last transition that we saw in here, we have all of these on a single line, which you can do. So you can manipulate multiple things at once, or you can use this kind of shorthand where you have a transition, and then there's each of these listed one by one. If you want to use the full syntax for transitions, like say you only want to you want everything to be specified on its own line and spelled out completely, this is where you would do that, but you can still do this with multiple properties. So what I've done here is, like, we can see the transition property down here is these two, right? The duration is here, the transition timing function is here, and then the second transform has a delay, but the first one doesn't. So those are reflected here and here. Timing functions. I'm not going to read through this list because we'll see each one of them individually, but these are not all of the timing functions available, but a few of them that I grouped together because they're kind of easy to group together. And we'll see what happens with each of these as we look at some examples. So the one that I want to point out here that's different from the others, that's sort of the base, like most basic way of doing this, is linear, which means that the animation has, or the transition has, one speed or one rate throughout. So there's no speeding up at the beginning or slowing down at the end. There's none of that. that is not the default. If you leave out a timing function, it's going to use ease, which is um, a little bit different. It has a it's meant to sort of smooth the transition for the eye of the viewer so that it doesn't seem quite so abrupt at the beginning and the end. And we'll look at some examples of these right here. So we have, if you're following along, you can also do this with me. But each one of these curves represents the time and intensity of the property that's being changed over that period. So these are all easing functions. So these are all related to ease in, ease out, ease, or ease in and out. These are all things that you can actually enter in that as a value for that property. Um, but if you look at the individual examples, it'll show you what the movement looks like and what the color change looks like. So each one of these deals with a color change, and then it shows you which time. So these are kind of hard for me personally to distinguish between. Like a lot of them look very similar, a lot of them feel very similar. So if you scroll down a bit, you can kind of get into more complex ones. These S-shaped curves, you can see where the transition is slow at first, then very fast, right, like this, and then slow again. More even more complex transitions will look like this, where there's actually some fluctuation happening. So you can be pretty specific about how you want this to appear, and it'll give you like a kind of like slowing down or speeding up effect or a bouncing effect. Like this one kind of, they call it in out elastic. It has like a little like pull on either side, just like these two do as well. The elastic, inelastic and out elastic. The bounce options are interesting, and these do the inverse of one another. So one eases in, one eases out, and then you have one that does this on both ends. So these can get quite complex. Um, the the simplest way to figure out what's going on within these, if you want to manipulate at a really basic level, is using something called a cubic Bezier timing function, and this takes 4 values. The values treat, if you like, in the next slide we'll look at an example, but they basically take the movement of the animation away from a center line, and that center line is represented like this, or can be represented like this. So in this case, here's our basic easing function. So if we have this is our cubic Bezier. So that's what that is, and we'll manipulate that in a second. And this is the basic ease function, or the default ease function. And you can watch how they change. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it, so it's more legible. We'll do that over 5 seconds. And if you're following along, please play with this. This is a really, really useful tool for understanding how transition timing can work. So you can see here, like the cubic Bezier is different than the ease function. So this is our ease function. That makes the movement sort of abrupt at first, but then slowly ease at the end. The current Bezier function is doing something else. It's making a like a kind of a rapid shift, and then it's a very shallow S. So watch what happens. Well, first let's switch to linear, because I want to see what a linear function looks like. So we'll press go, and see the one at the bottom is moving. It looks like it's moving slower across, but it's just because it's moving at a completely smooth rate. It doesn't speed up or slow down. So this is a really good reference point for what's happening over here. So let's make a kind of an S. Let's pull this all the way down to 0. And you can use negative values if you want to make them go even further. So let's leave that at 0, and then let's pull this one up all the way to 1. All right, so we have, there we go. So we have a pretty straightforward S-shaped kind of curve. Look what happens. It speeds way up at the beginning, slows down, and then it speeds up again at the end. So that looks a bit more like some of those S-shaped functions we saw in the last example. Let's see what this does if we put it. I really encourage you to play around with this. If we put that right here and press go, we're going to get really rapid movement at the beginning, and then a very, very slow long tail of movement at the end. It like creeps to the finish line over here. Similarly, if we pull these the other way, so last time we had these set in a different shaped S, like a reverse S. This should be slow, then fast, then slow. Now the nice thing about a tool like this example is that you can set all of this however you want, and then you have this as the value that you need to be able to do that. So if I want to make this look like this and be kind of slow in the beginning, a little faster in the middle, and then kind of slow at the end, these are the numbers that I would use to do that in my CSS. There's another set that this sort of does the opposite, right, of what the smoothing and easing functions do, in that it makes steps. So everything has a kind of a jolty aspect to it. So let's see what these look like. The steps takes an integer, so it just has to be, like a number greater than 0. It has to be a whole number, obviously, because you can't have kind of a half step. But that's really all it needs is a number of steps. And then this second parameter decides whether the movement of the step happens at the beginning or the end. And that's a little bit difficult to see, but we might be able to see it in the example on here. All right, so with these, if you're following along again, you can do this with me. So I have a series of divs, series of boxes, and when we hover over these, they're going to change based on this hover. So the width is going to move from 100 pixels to 300 pixels, and then the timing functions for each of the divs is laid out here. That's the only transition property or value that we've changed here. The other ones are all governed the same. So it will take 2 seconds to move across, and then we'll have a linear one, several eases, and then steps. So the linear one looks just about like we'd expect it to. It moves back and forth at a smooth rate. Ease does just what we saw it do before. Ease in, similar. Ease out. and then the one that does both ends. And then here we get to the steps. So instead of, I want to actually make this a little bit longer so we can see it a bit better. And maybe I can't in here. No, okay, so I'm not going to make it longer. Just pay close attention. All right, so when I mouse over the step start one, you see it just pushes those blocks out. It moves 5 blocks across. And then similarly, the steps end does this. But if we push them all out at the same time, you can see that their movement is happening. It's kind of opposite. The start and end parameter is not terribly useful unless you're unless you really want to get specific with using steps. But I don't see that happening necessarily. So that's all for this bit. And next time we're going to talk about transforms and how they can be used in combination with transitions. I recommend that you take a look at some of the online resources about transitions. W3 Schools is always a good place to start because there are examples, code examples, and then also playable, runnable examples. CSS Tricks also has some really good manipulable examples, and then the Mozilla site, all of which you're familiar with by now, is another good option. So you'll want to click through and go to that next video, and I will catch you there.